stealing from the dead, a haunting tale of greed and punishment. In a rural, impoverished village nestled near treacherous mountains, a widow named Sen struggles to raise her two children, Lan and little Loi. Life is harsh, but the family bonds provide solace amidst poverty and the lingering shadows of tragedy. When a sudden landslide destroys their fragile home during a stormy night, the family's fate is sealed under an avalanche of earth and rock. As villagers scramble to uncover any survivors, one man, driven by greed and malice, steals money buried with the dead. But what he does not realize is that this grave betrayal has awakened a sinister force. From the shadows of despair, a chilling presence emerges, intent on reclaiming justice from beyond. As the thief is hunted by a vengeful spirit and eerie encounters grow ever more terrifying, he realizes there are prices far greater than wealth. Death's vengeance is not easily escaped. Part 1. A struggling family. In a remote village clinging to the steep edges of a rugged mountain range, life moves slowly and harshly. Here, surrounded by peaks that touch the clouds and paths carved from unforgiving stone, Seng lived with her two children, Lan and Loi. Since the death of her husband many years ago, Sen had struggled to make ends meet. Every morning she rose before the sun, her hands cracked from the cold, her body weary but unyielding. Life was an endless cycle of labor, and every breath she took felt like a battle fought for survival. Her home, a wooden structure barely holding together, leaned precariously on uneven ground. The roof was patched with whatever material she could find, and the wind howled through every crack and gap, as though mocking her attempts to keep it out. But inside, Seng created what warmth she could. She sang softly to her children, her voice worn but still capable of weaving tender moments into their otherwise bleak existence. For Lan, who had turned 15 with a quiet grace, and little Loi, whose wide eyes still sparkled despite it all, these were the memories that kept the darkness of poverty at bay. Lan was clever and kind, helping her mother with the chores while stealing moments to dream of a better life. She would often sit by the window, looking out at the thick forest beyond, wishing for an escape from their harsh reality. Loi, only 8 years old, clung to his sister's every word. He marveled at her stories and clumsy jokes, his laughter brightening the dim room. Their evenings were spent gathered around the flickering kerosene lamp, eating simple meals that left their stomachs half full but their spirits warmer. Each grain of rice, each scrap of vegetable was hard-won. Yet, in this fragile household, their bond was as strong as any mountain surrounding them. Sen found solace in their company, and for a brief time she could forget her aching body and empty hands. The village itself was a place of hardship. Built at the foot of a towering cliff, it was constantly under the threat of rock slides and floods. The paths were treacherous, the land yielded little, and the villagers worked themselves to the bone for meager sustenance. Community gatherings were rare, and each household fended for itself. But in this environment, the bond between Sen and her children was their shield against despair. It made them different, resilient, and it would be tested in ways none of them could foresee. One evening, as the sky began to darken, Sen put down her needle and thread. She was mending an old coat, its fabric rough and worn thin, but it was all they had. "Lan, is dinner ready?" she asked, her voice gentle but tinged with exhaustion. The smell of boiled rice wafted from the kitchen corner, where Lan was stirring a pot over a modest fire. "Almost, Mother," Lan replied, her smile softening her features despite her tired eyes. But little Loi, who had been playing with a wooden toy that he had carved from a fallen branch, perked up at the mention of food. His stomach growled audibly, and both women laughed a sound so rare that it felt almost foreign. As they sat down to eat, the quiet evening air was suddenly pierced by the distant rumble of thunder. A storm was approaching, a reminder of their precarious existence. Sen glanced toward the doorway, her instincts sharpened by years of living on the edge of danger. "It's going to be a bad one," she murmured. Lan nodded, already feeling the tension that came with each storm. The mountains around them were as cruel as they were beautiful, and when they turned against the village they did so with devastating force. Dinner passed in tense silence, each bite chewed with the knowledge that survival was never guaranteed. Sen finally broke the quiet with a hesitant smile, attempting to lighten the mood. "Your uncle spoke to me today, Lan. There's a family in the next village." She trailed off, unsure how to continue. Lan's fork paused in midair. "Mother, please." Her voice was firm, her eyes wide with something between fear and resignation. "I'm not ready for that." Sen's heart ached her daughter's reaction. She knew what marriage would mean, a life just as hard, if not harder, than the one Lan had now. But in their world, choices were a luxury they could not afford. "I understand," she whispered, placing a comforting hand over Lan's. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unsaid truths of their harsh existence. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the shutters. Rain began to patter against the roof, a soft warning that soon turned into a roar. Sen rose and bolted the door, casting a wary glance at the forest beyond. The storm had arrived, and with it, the mountain's wrath was unleashed. As the hours wore on, the rain intensified. It was relentless, pounding the earth until it could take no more. The ground beneath their home trembled, a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar. Sen's eyes widened in terror as she realized what was happening. "Landslide," she screamed, grabbing for her children. Lan clutched Loie, her grip desperate as the world around them seemed to come apart. The mountainside gave way, a wall of mud, rock, and debris hurtling down with unstoppable force. It crashed into their fragile home, splintering wood and swallowing everything in its path. For a moment there was only chaos and unbearable cacophony of destruction and screams, and then silence. Silence. Morning brought no comfort. The storm had passed, but its aftermath was a scene of desolation. Villagers gathered, their faces etched with shock and sorrow as they dug through the debris. Among them was Hill, a man whose reputation for selfishness and greed was known by all. While others searched for survivors, Hill's eyes were drawn to something glinting in the mud, a bundle of money, soaked but unmistakable. Without hesitation, he pocketed it, glancing around to make sure no one had seen. But he was not alone. The mountains had eyes, and the dead demanded justice. That night, Hugh's dreams were restless. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and a cold wind whispered through his home. When he awoke, a pale figure stood at the foot of his bed. Lan's face was pale, her eyes hollow. "Return what you stole," she said, her voice like the wind, cold and empty. Hugh stumbled back, heart pounding in terror. He tried to speak, but no words came. The apparition faded, leaving only the scent of wet earth behind. Each night the haunting grew worse. Whispers in the dark, footsteps that echoed through empty rooms, and glimpses of mud-streaked hands reaching for him. Hugh's mind frayed, his body weakened. Desperate to escape, he tried to rid himself of the cursed money, throwing it into the mudslide's remnants. But it was too late. The spirits would not be satisfied so easily. One final night, the roots of the mountain rose against him. They coiled around his legs, dragging him into the earth. The villagers found him days later, his lifeless body twisted, his eyes wide with terror. Sen, Lan, and Loie were buried together, remembered as victims of nature's wrath. But whispers continued, stories of a ghostly figure watching from the mountainside, a girl with eyes that spoke of sorrow and vengeance, ensuring that no one would steal from the dead again. Part 2. The Unwanted Proposal. On a quiet evening, the dim orange glow of a kerosene lamp filled the small room with flickering light. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting and bending with each gust of wind that found its way through the cracks in the wooden house. San sat on the edge of her creaking stool, her hands worn and tired from years of toil, cradling a bowl of rice porridge. Across the small rickety table, Lan, her 15-year-old daughter, delicately spooned the meager meal into her mouth, trying not to betray the gnawing hunger they all felt. Little Loai had already eaten and was now sprawled out on the small, thin mat they all shared, fast asleep. His chest rose and fell with the innocence of a child blissfully unaware of their struggles. Sen's gaze lingered on her son before turning back to Lan. She hesitated, her heart pounding as she weighed the words she was about to say. The weight of their circumstances pressed down on her, and the fragile hope that had kept them going felt brittle, ready to shatter. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, until finally she spoke. Lan, she said softly, her voice cracking just slightly. I spoke with your uncle today. Lan paused, the spoon halfway to her lips. There was something in her mother's tone that made her stomach twist. She lowered the spoon, meeting Sen's weary eyes. What did he say, mother? She asked, though she already sensed the answer. It was in the way her mother avoided her gaze, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly as they gripped the bowl. Sen took a deep breath, forcing herself to keep her composure. There is a family in the next village, she began slowly. They have a son. Your uncle says they are good people, stable. They asked about you. Lan's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. Her throat went dry. Marriage, she whispered, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. You want to marry me off? It's not what I want, Sen said quickly, pain flickering across her face. I want you here. I want us together. Always her voice trembled. But this family can offer you more than I can. They have land. They have security. Security, Lan's voice rose, a mix of disbelief and frustration. You think marrying me off will make me secure? Trading one cage for another? I don't want that. Mother Sen felt tears welling up in her eyes but blinked them away. Lan, it's not a cage, it's a chance. You could have more than this, she said, motioning to their worn surroundings. I can't give you a life free of struggle. I can barely keep you and Loai fed. If something were to happen to me, don't say that. Lan cried, her voice cracking. She pushed away her bowl, the clatter echoing in the small room. Don't talk like that. We'll manage just like we always have. Sen reached for her daughter's hand, but Lan pulled away, rising to her feet. She paced the small space, her emotions raw, her movements jerky and restless. This is my life, mother. I don't want to give up what little freedom I have. I don't want to live my days as someone else's servant, bearing children, growing old without a single dream of my own. Freedom, Sen repeated quietly, the word heavy with sorrow. I want that for you too, Lamb. But here, in this village, it doesn't exist for girls like us. Lan stopped pacing, turning to face her mother. Tears streamed down her cheeks, unchecked. Then we'll leave. We'll go somewhere else. Where? Lan Sen asked, her voice harsh with desperation. Where would we go? Do you think the world outside these mountains is any kinder? Do you think it would welcome us? 2 women and a child with nothing but empty hands and dreams. Lan stared at her mother, anger and hopelessness battling within her. You're asking me to give up everything, mother. My future, my dreams. For what? To be sold off for a few coins of security? That's not what this is, Sen insisted, her own voice growing louder. I would never sell you, Lan. Never. This isn't about coins. It's about giving you a chance to survive, to have a roof over your head when I can no longer provide. A bitter laugh escaped Lan's lips. A roof over my head? I'd rather sleep under the stars with my freedom than in a house where I'm little more than a prisoner. The words stung, cutting deep into Sen's heart. She stood, the years of hardship etched into her face, making her appear older than her age. You think I want this? You think this is easy for me? Her voice broke, raw and anguished. I have spent every waking moment fighting for you and Loai. I would lay down my life for you both, but I cannot promise you a future. I don't have. Lan's anger faded, replaced by a suffocating wave of guilt. She stepped closer to her mother, their faces inches apart. Mother, I know you love me. I know you want what's best. But this isn't it? The storm outside mirrored the storm within the small house, wind howling and rain lashing against the walls. For a long moment they stood in silence, listening to the fury of the elements, their hearts heavy with unspoken fears and fragile hopes. "I want you to be happy," Sen whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "But happiness, it's hard to find here." Lan closed her eyes, letting the tears fall. "Then we'll find it together. We'll make our own way." "Please, Mother, don't give me away." Sen pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tight. "I won't," she promised, her voice choked with emotion. "I won't." The wind outside raged on, but inside, mother and daughter clung to each other, bound by love and the fragile hope that they could carve out a better life together. For a brief moment, they allowed themselves to believe it was possible, even as the storm continued to batter their world. Part 3. The storm approaches. The air was thick with tension that night, a palpable heaviness that seemed to press down on the village from all sides. Clouds, dark and swollen with rain, rolled over the jagged peaks, blotting out the moon and stars. Sen stood in the doorway of their small, creaking home, her eyes scanning the horizon with unease. The wind had picked up, rustling the brittle leaves and howling through the narrow paths that wound between the homes scattered across the mountainside. "Mother, is something wrong?" Lan's voice, calm but tinged with worry, broke through Sen's thoughts. Sen turned to see her daughter standing in the dim glow of their kerosene lamp, concern etched deeply into her young face. Behind Lan, little Loe clutched a wooden toy, his wide eyes darting between his mother and sister. He could sense the tension in the air, though he did not understand it. "It's just a storm, nothing to worry about," Sen said, trying to keep her voice steady. But even as she spoke, she could feel the light twisting in her chest. This was no ordinary storm. She knew the signs too well: the oppressive stillness before the wind's fury, the low rumble in the earth, and the scent of rain heavy enough to drown anything in its path. The wind howled louder, rattling the shutters and whistling through the cracks in the walls. Sen moved quickly, pulling the door shut and securing it with an old wooden beam. "Lan, gather whatever you can. We need to be ready," she said, her voice clipped and urgent. Lan nodded, her movements quick but precise as she hurried to grab their few possessions. Blankets, a small sack of rice, a clay jar of water. They had so little, yet it felt like too much to protect. Loy watched them with wide, fearful eyes. "Mother, what's happening?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sen knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. "It's just a storm, Loy. We'll stay inside together, and it will pass." She tried to sound reassuring, but even to her own ears, the words rang hollow. The wind shrieked again, as if mocking her attempt at comfort. Suddenly, the first drops of rain began to fall. They were heavy and cold, pounding against the roof with a rhythm that quickly turned relentless. Within minutes, the ground outside their home transformed into rivers of mud, swirling and churning with the fury of the storm. Sen felt the house shudder beneath her feet as the wind pressed against it, testing its fragile strength. "Lan, stay close to me," she said, pulling her daughter near. She could feel Lan's rapid heartbeat, mirroring her own. Loy clung to her leg, his small body trembling. The storm's roar grew deafening, a cacophony of wind, rain, and the creaking groan of their home straining against the elements. Sen's instinct screamed at her this was more than a storm. This was a force of nature, uncaring and all-consuming, that sought to devour everything in its path. She had heard tales of landslides, of entire families swallowed by the earth when the mountains decided to shift. Now, those tales felt all too real. Mother Lan's voice was sharp with fear. Sen followed her daughter's gaze to the walls, where water was seeping through the cracks, trickling down in thin rivulets. The earth beneath their home was shifting, softening under the relentless assault of rain. "We need to go," Lam pleaded, panic rising. But where could they go? Outside was a torrent of mud and debris. To leave the house was to step into the storm's jaws. "No," Sen said, forcing herself to think. "We stay together. We stay here." The wind screamed, a banshee's wail that sent shivers down Sen's spine. She could feel the house shifting, the floorboards trembling beneath her feet. A sudden crash outside made her heart leap into her throat. It was the sound of rocks breaking free, tumbling down the mountainside. The storm had awoken something ancient and cruel, the mountain itself. Sen grabbed Lan and Loy, pulling them into a tight embrace. "Whatever happens, stay with me," she whispered, her voice fierce. "We'll face it together." She could feel their fear, their small, fragile bodies clinging to her as the world around them seemed to come undone. The rain intensified, hammering down with unrelenting force. Mud surged around the house, rising like a dark tide. The ground shifted again, and this time it did not stop. The house lurched, tilting to one side. Sen gasped, holding on to her children as the floor buckled beneath them. The walls groaned, and a crack split the ceiling, sending splinters of wood raining down. "Hold on," Sen shouted, but her voice was lost in the roar of the storm. The house shook violently, and for a moment it felt as if the entire world was spinning. Then, with a deafening crash, the wall facing the mountainside gave way. A torrent of mud and debris poured in, sweeping everything in its path. Lan screamed, her voice raw with terror. Sen tightened her grip, trying to shield her children, but the force of the mudslide was unstoppable. It slammed into them, tearing them apart and dragging them into the swirling darkness. The last thing Sen saw was Lan's terrified face, her hand reaching out, fingers slipping from her grasp. The world went black. When Sen opened her eyes, she was buried beneath mud and debris. She could barely breathe, each gasp of air a struggle. Pain seared through her body, but her mind was focused on one thing: her children. "Lan, Lord," she tried to scream, but her voice was weak, swallowed by the mud and rain. There was no answer. Panic surged through her, giving her the strength to move. She clawed at the mud, her nails breaking and bleeding as she dug. Every inch felt like a mile, every breath a battle. "Please," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain and mud on her face. "Please let them be alive," but the storm raged on, deaf to her pleas. Part 4. The Landslide. The first hint of the disaster came as a deep, bone-rattling tremor that shook the ground beneath their feet. Sen felt it reverberate through her body, a warning from the heart of the mountain itself. She stood in the dimly lit room, holding tightly to Lan and little Loy, her knuckles white and her breath caught in her throat. The air was heavy with moisture, thick and suffocating, as if even the storm itself was afraid to breathe. Outside, the wind howled, tearing through the trees and ripping branches from their trunks. Rain battered the roof like 1,000 fists, each drop a harbinger of what was to come. The ground beneath the house shifted again, groaning in protest. "Stay close," Sen whispered, her voice taut with fear. She tightened her grip on her children, feeling their trembling bodies pressed against hers. A sudden deafening crack split the air, and the world seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, everything was still eerily, unnaturally still. Then, with a sound like thunder amplified 100-fold, the mountainside gave way. An unstoppable wall of mud, rocks, and debris hurtled toward their fragile home, tearing apart everything in its path. Mother Lan screamed, her voice raw with terror. Sen barely had time to react. She shoved her children toward the far wall, trying to shield them with her body. "Get down," she shouted, her words drowned by the roar of the earth itself. The walls of their home buckled, splintering under the force of the oncoming landslide. Mud poured through every crack and crevice, a dark, suffocating wave that swallowed everything it touched. The impact threw Sen to the ground, her breath knocked from her lungs. Pain shot through her side, but she forced herself to move. She had to reach her children. "Lan, low," she cried, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of destruction. She could see Lan, her eyes wide with terror, clinging desperately to a broken beam. Little Loy was nowhere to be seen. The floor tilted beneath her, sending her sprawling. Mud and debris pressed in from all sides, cold and unyielding. Every breath was a struggle, every movement a fight against the crushing weight of the landslide. Sen clawed at the ground, her hands slick with mud and blood. "Hold on," she screamed, her voice hoarse and broken. She could see Lan slipping, her fingers losing their grip on the splintered wood. Mother Lam's voice was a desperate plea, cut off as another wave of debris crashed into the room. Sen lunged forward, her fingers scraping against the mud as she tried to reach her daughter. But it was too late. The force of the landslide ripped them apart, burying Lam beneath a torrent of earth and rock. No, the word tore from Sen's throat, a raw, guttural sound of anguish. She thrashed against the mud, her body screaming in protest. Every instinct demanded that she keep fighting, keep searching, but the weight pressing down on her was relentless. It filled her mouth, her nose, her lungs, suffocating her. Darkness closed in at the edges of her vision, but she refused to give in. Lan. Lloyd, their names were a mantra, a desperate prayer. The roar of the landslide gradually faded, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. The storm still raged above, but its fury seemed muted, as if it too had been silenced by the mountain's wrath. Sen lay motionless, buried beneath layers of mud and debris. Pain was a distant thing now, overshadowed by the crushing weight of despair. Somewhere beneath the rubble, Lan and Loy lay trapped. Sen's heart shattered at the thought. She had failed them. The realization was a blade that cut deeper than any physical wound. Tears mixed with the mud on her face, and she let out a choked sob. This couldn't be the end, not like this, but the mountain was merciless. It pressed down on her, cold and unfeeling. The weight of the earth was suffocating, crushing the air from her lungs. Sen's vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she saw Lan's face, pale and frightened, but determined. Mother, the vision whispered, and Sen's heart lurched. Was it real, or was it the last desperate flicker of her mind? She tried to move, to reach out one last time, but her strength was gone. Darkness swallowed her, and the world fell away. Time lost all meaning. Hours, minutes, seconds, it all blurred together in the cold, suffocating darkness. The storm above raged on, oblivious to the lives it had shattered. Mud and debris settled, hardening like a tomb around the ruined house. The mountain, once a silent guardian, now loomed as a grave marker. When the rain finally began to ease, the village lay in ruins. Those who survived stumbled through the mud, searching for signs of life, but there was little hope. The landslide had left nothing but destruction in its wake. Beneath the earth, Sen's body lay still, trapped in a prison of mud and stone. Yet, even in the depths of despair, there was a flicker of something: rage, sorrow, love. It lingered, unbroken, like a heartbeat in the darkness. The mountain had taken everything from her, but it could not extinguish the bond she shared with her children. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating, as the mountain reclaimed its dominion. But deep beneath the rubble, a mother's love refused to be buried. Part 5. The Aftermath. Dawn broke slowly over the shattered village, the sky still heavy with the remnants of the storm. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with the pungent smell of wet earth and splintered wood. Steam rose from the ground as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, casting a pale, ghostly light over the devastation. Mud stretched as far as the eye could see, littered with broken timbers, uprooted trees, and shards of what once were homes. Villagers gathered at the edge of the destruction, their faces pale and haunted. There was no time for shock or grief. They moved with a grim determination, calling out names, sifting through the debris with bleeding hands. Each passing moment was precious. They all knew that beneath the mud and rubble, someone might still be alive, trapped, waiting, hoping. He was among them, though his reasons for being there were different. He moved quickly, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow, every broken piece of wood. A man of lean build and narrow eyes, he had always been known for his opportunistic nature. Where others saw tragedy, he saw potential gain. He muttered half-hearted words of encouragement to the villagers around him, but his hands were not searching for survivors, they were searching for something more tangible, something that would make this calamity worthwhile for him. He spotted a young woman kneeling in the mud, frantically digging with her bare hands. "Please, someone help me," she cried, tears streaking her mud-covered face. Hugh hesitated for a moment, then turned away. Her cries faded into the background noise of despair. He had no time for compassion, not when there were opportunities to seize. As he moved deeper into the rubble, the air seemed to grow colder. The mud was thick and clung to his legs, each step a laborious effort. His breath fogged in the chill morning air, and his heartbeat quickened. It was here, in the heart of the devastation, that he saw a glimmer of something bright, half buried in the muck. Hugh's eyes narrowed. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the cold seeping into his bones. With trembling hands he clawed at the mud, uncovering what he had glimpsed, a bundle wrapped in cloth, soaked and caked with mud. He pulled it free, his pulse pounding. The cloth fell away, revealing a stack of banknotes, damp but unmistakable. The sight of the money made his breath catch in his throat. In this village, where every coin was hard-won and every scrap of food was precious, such wealth was a miracle, or, in this case, a gift delivered by fate itself. For a moment, Hugh glanced around, his body tense. No one was watching. The other villagers were too absorbed in their desperate search for loved ones, their faces streaked with tears and mud. Hugh's lips curled into a thin smile. He tucked the money into his shirt, feeling its weight against his chest. It was warm, almost as if it were alive, but as he stood, a chill ran down his spine. The air around him felt heavy, oppressive. The wind, which had been silent moments before, picked up, whispering through the broken trees and rubble. It carried a sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the earth itself. Hugh shivered and shook his head. It was just the wind, he told himself, just the wind. He turned to leave, but his foot caught on something buried in the mud. He stumbled, catching himself just in time. Annoyed, he bent down to see what had tripped him. His hands brushed away the mud, revealing a small, broken hand. Hugh's heart stopped. The hand was pale, the fingers delicate and still. It was Lamb. Her eyes were open, staring up at the sky with a lifeless gaze. Mud caked her hair and skin, and her face was frozen in an expression of terror. For a moment Hugh felt a pang of guilt, a flicker of something that almost made him drop to his knees. But he pushed it away. She was dead. There was nothing he could do for her. The living had to fend for themselves. He stood quickly, his breath coming in short gasps. The money pressed against his chest felt suddenly cold, like a shard of ice. He glanced around again, half expecting to see accusing eyes watching him. But the villagers were still focused on their desperate search. No one had seen him. No one knew what he had done. As Hugh made his way back through the wreckage, the whispers in the wind grew louder. They seemed to follow him, echoing in the trees and the debris. "Thief," they whispered. Thief, he shook his head, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside him now, crawling under his skin. His steps quickened, mud sucking at his feet as he tried to escape the voices. Each whisper was a needle of ice pricking at his nerves, fraying his composure. Back at the edge of the village, he paused, breathing heavily. He forced himself to calm down. It was just the aftermath of the storm, the wind, the shock of what had happened. He would go home, hide the money, and let the villagers think he had worked himself to exhaustion, just like everyone else. He would be fine. But the whispers did not stop. That night, as darkness fell over the village, they followed him into his dreams. Shadows gathered in the corners of his room, cold and silent. The money lay hidden beneath his mattress, but its presence was suffocating. Hugh tossed and turned, his sleep broken by nightmares of pale hands reaching for him, of mud and blood and broken eyes that saw too much. The villagers continued their search, digging through the rubble with bare hands and aching hearts. They found bodies, too many bodies. The dead were honored with tears and prayers, but hope was fading. Hugh kept his distance, avoiding their eyes, his own guilt festering beneath a mask of indifference. But the mountain was not done with him. As the days passed, strange things began to happen. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Shadows moved when they shouldn't. Cold air clung to him, no matter how warm the day. And at night, in the darkness of his small home, he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting. Hugh's grip on reality began to fray. He told himself it was just guilt, just the strain of what they had all endured. But deep down he knew the truth. The mountain had seen him, the dead had seen him, and they would not rest until justice was done. The money in his possession felt like a curse, each note a piece of his soul slipping away. Yet, driven by fear and greed, he clung to it, even as the shadows crept closer. In the end, he would learn what it meant to steal from the dead. But for now he walked among the living, haunted by the weight of his choices and the whispers of a storm that had yet to pass. Part 6. The haunting begins. Night descended upon the village like a suffocating shroud, bringing with it a chill that bit deeper than the cold of the storm-ravaged mountain. Hugh sat in the corner of his dimly lit hut, the single candle's flame flickering wildly, casting jagged, erratic shadows across the walls. He could not escape the gnawing feeling in his chest, the sensation that something unseen had latched onto him since he took the bundle of money from the mud. It had seemed like a gift from fate in the chaos of the disaster, but now it felt like a curse that burned against his skin. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to weave through the cracks in his walls. At first, Hugh thought it was just his imagination, the echo of guilt rattling around in his mind. But then the whispers grew louder, distinct, like a dozen voices speaking over one another, too low to understand yet unmistakably accusatory. He pressed his hands over his ears, trying to shut them out. "It's just the wind," he muttered to himself, but even as he spoke, he knew it was a lie. The shadows in the corners of his hut deepened, stretching and shifting as if alive. Hugh's breath quickened. He could feel something watching him, eyes that pierced through the darkness, cold and unblinking. His candle flickered once more and then sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through him. He stumbled to his feet, knocking over a wooden stool in his haste. His heart pounded in his chest, loud enough to drown out the whispering, if only for a moment. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. Silence answered. He took a step forward, his hands outstretched, blindly reaching for something, anything that would ground him in reality. Then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was the faint rustling of fabric, as if someone had moved just out of sight. Hugh froze, his mouth dry. "Show yourself," he cried, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. The air grew colder, and Hugh felt a chill crawl up his spine. From the corner of the room, a pale, ethereal light began to take shape. It flickered and wavered, as if caught between this world and the next. Slowly, the form of a young girl emerged, her hair matted with mud, her skin deathly pale. It was Lan. Her eyes, once filled with life and hope, were now hollow voids that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. Hugh stumbled backward, his legs weak. "No, this isn't real," he whispered, his voice shaking. Lan took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. The mud-streaked dress she wore clung to her fragile frame, and water dripped from her hair, pooling on the floor. She raised a hand, pointing at him with fingers that trembled, not from fear, but from rage. "Thief," she said, her voice a hollow echo that reverberated through the room. The word cut through Hugh like a blade, and he clutched at his chest as if trying to hold himself together. "You took what was not yours. You stole from the dead." "No," Hugh protested, his voice desperate. I didn't know," returned Lamb whispered, her words carrying the weight of 1,000 accusations. "Return what you took, or you will never know peace." The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost formed on the walls, and Hugh's breath came out in visible puffs. He backed away, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Ghosts weren't real. Spirits didn't come back for vengeance. But as he looked into Lan's empty eyes, he knew that this was no mere hallucination. The dead had risen, and they demanded retribution. The shadows around him shifted again, and Hugh felt the walls closing in. Whispers filled the air, dozens of voices, all speaking at once. Some were angry, others mournful, but all of them blamed him. He fell to his knees, covering his ears and squeezing his eyes shut. "Stop it, leave me alone," he screamed, but the voices only grew louder, pressing against him like an invisible weight. Lan moved closer, her feet leaving no trace on the ground. She leaned down, her face inches from his. "You cannot escape this," she said, her breath cold against his skin. "You are marked with that." The whispers ceased, and the oppressive cold lifted. He opened his eyes, his heart racing. The room was empty. The shadows were gone, and the candle lay on its side unlit. But the feeling of dread remained. He scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking as he searched for the bundle of money hidden beneath his mattress. When he pulled it out, it felt heavier than before, as if it carried the weight of every sin he had ever committed. He had to return it, that much was clear. But where? How? The mudslide had buried everything: Lan, her family, their home. There was no way to undo what had been done. Panic gripped him. "It's not enough," a voice whispered in his ear. He spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows crept closer again, and he realized that the haunting would not end so easily. Over the next few days, Hugh's life became a waking nightmare. Shadows moved when they shouldn't. He heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned, no one was there. The whispers followed him everywhere: at the market, in the fields, even in the rare moments when he managed to close his eyes and drift into a restless sleep. Lan appeared to him again and again, her presence growing stronger, more malevolent. She would stand at the foot of his bed, her eyes burning with cold fire, or whisper in his ear as he worked, chilling his blood. One night he awoke to find himself standing outside in the mud, the bundle of money clutched tightly in his hands. He had no memory of how he got there. The wind howled around him, and Lan's ghost appeared once more, her expression colder than before. "You cannot keep it," she said, her voice low and venomous. "It will consume you." "I'll give it back," Hugh cried, falling to his knees. "I'll do whatever you want, just leave me alone." Lan tilted her head, as if considering his plea. "It is too late for that," she said. "You have already been judged." The shadows closed in, wrapping around Hugh like chains. He felt their cold touch, heard their whispers echoing through his mind. The weight of his guilt, his greed pressed down on him, suffocating him. He knew then that there would be no escape. The dead would not rest until justice was served. As the night stretched on, Hugh felt himself slipping further into madness. He could see no end to the torment, no way to atone for what he had done. The money he had stolen was a curse, a tether to the spirits that haunted him. And as Lan's ghost faded into the darkness, leaving him alone with the weight of his sins, he understood that he had unleashed something far more terrifying than he could ever comprehend. The haunting had only just begun. Part 7. Descent into Madness. The days following the first appearance of Lan's ghost were a waking nightmare for Hugh. He wandered the village with hollow eyes, his face pale and gaunt. He could not eat, every bite turned to ash in his mouth. Sleep was a luxury he no longer knew, for every time he closed his eyes he would see her standing over him, her mud-streaked hair clinging to her ghostly skin, her gaze like ice. Even in the daylight, when the sun was high and warm, Hugh felt the cold presence of shadows trailing him, always just out of sight. He tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but it was impossible. The whispers were relentless, scratching at the edges of his sanity. They spoke in a cacophony of accusations, some too low to understand, others screamed with such force that they made him flinch. "Thief! Betrayer, you will pay at times," he thought he heard Lan's voice, clear and cold, cutting through the din. "Return what you stole." Hugh clutched the bundle of money tighter, his hands trembling. It had become an anchor around his neck, a constant reminder of his greed and the curse it had brought upon him. The weight of it seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. He knew he had to get rid of it, but no matter how many times he tried to convince himself to throw it away, something stopped him. Perhaps it was the faint, lingering hope that he could still profit from it. Perhaps it was fear that releasing it would only make the spirit's wrath worse. The villagers noticed his change. They whispered about him when they thought he couldn't hear, their eyes wary and suspicious. He avoided their gazes, too afraid of what they might see in his haunted expression. When they spoke to him, he could barely manage to respond, and when he did, his words were clipped and frantic. He was unraveling, and everyone could see it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew long, Hugh made up his mind. He would return the money. He would go to the site of the landslide, where Lan's family had been buried beneath mud and rock, and leave it there. Perhaps that would be enough to end the torment. He clung to the hope like a drowning man grasping for a lifeline. The trek to the landslide was harrowing. The air grew colder with each step, and the forest seemed to close in around him. Twigs snapped beneath his feet, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying voices that mocked and accused. "She is waiting," they hissed. "You cannot escape." Hugh's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of his fear. He reached the edge of the landslide, where the ground was still raw and scarred from the mountain's wrath. Mud and debris lay in chaotic heaps, a graveyard of shattered homes and broken lives. Hugh stepped forward, his legs trembling. The bundle of money felt like a lead weight in his hands. He knelt down, his fingers shaking as he placed it on the ground. "Take it back," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." The wind picked up suddenly, whipping around him with a fury that stole his breath. The trees groaned and creaked, and the air was filled with the scent of wet earth. Hugh felt the ground shift beneath him, and he scrambled back, fear clawing at his chest. But before he could move further, an invisible force gripped him, freezing him in place. It was as if the earth itself had come alive, wrapping around his ankles, holding him fast. "No," he gasped, his eyes wide with terror. He tried to pull away, but the grip only tightened, dragging him down. The mud beneath him swirled, dark tendrils rising like serpents to coil around his arms and legs. They were cold, impossibly cold, and they burned with a searing, unnatural chill. Hugh struggled, but it was useless. The more he fought, the deeper he sank. Lan appeared before him, her ghostly form flickering in and out of existence. Her expression was one of sorrow and rage, her eyes pools of darkness. "It is too late," she said, her voice echoing with the weight of the grave. "You cannot undo what you have done." "I'm sorry," Hugh screamed, his voice raw with desperation. "I'll make it right. Please, please." Lan's gaze never wavered. "You stole from the dead. Now, the dead will claim what is theirs." The tendrils tightened, dragging him further into the mud. Cold seeped into his bones, numbing his limbs. He could barely move, barely breathe. Shadows swirled around him, whispering in a language he did not understand, but whose meaning was clear: judgment, retribution, punishment. The wind howled, and the sky darkened as if the sun itself had turned its back on him. In his mind, Hugh saw flashes of faces: Lan's, her mother's, the other villagers who had been lost in the landslide. They stared at him, their expressions twisted with pain and accusation. "You took what was not yours," they said, their voices blending into one. "You cannot escape." The weight of their gaze crushed him. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the mud. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean. I just..." But the spirits showed no mercy. The ground beneath him opened wider, swallowing him inch by inch. He could feel the cold mud pressing against his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he saw Lan's hand reaching out to him, not to save him, but to pull him deeper. Darkness closed in around him. The whispers grew louder, a deafening chorus that drowned out all thought. Hugh's mind fractured, splintering beneath the weight of his fear and guilt. He screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. The shadows consumed him, dragging him down, until there was nothing left but the cold, unfeeling earth. When the villagers found him the next day, he was half buried in the mud, his eyes wide and unseeing. The bundle of money lay nearby, untouched. No one dared to touch it. They whispered of curses and spirits, of greed and retribution. And as the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of a mournful wail, They knew that the dead were still watching, still waiting. For Hugh there was no escape. Madness had claimed him, and the shadows would never let him go. Part 8. Retribution. The night was heavy with a suffocating stillness, as if the very air knew that something unspeakable was about to unfold. Hugh stumbled through the forest, his breath ragged and uneven. Each step was a struggle, his legs weighed down by exhaustion and the thick, cloying mud that clung to his every movement. The bundle of money was gone, thrown away in a desperate attempt to end the torment that had been haunting him day and night. But it had not worked. The whispers, the shadows, and the cold, spectral presence of land, they were all still there, pressing in on him with a suffocating weight. Hugh's mind was a whirlwind of fear and desperation. He had tried everything, prayers, offerings, even pleading with the spirits themselves. But the dead would not be appeased. Their rage was as unyielding as the mountains that had swallowed their lives. Now all that was left for him was flight. He had to get away, far from the village, far from the cursed ground that held the memories of his crime. Perhaps if he ran far enough he could escape their grasp. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees towering and gnarled, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to ensnare him. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, flickering and shifting with every step he took. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying with it voices that chilled him to the bone. "We cannot run," they hissed. "We cannot hide," Nohayo muttered, his voice trembling. "You're not real. You're not real. You're not..." He pressed on, his eyes wild and unfocused. The forest floor was slick with mud, and the roots of ancient trees snaked across the ground, hidden beneath the dark sludge. His foot caught on one, sending him sprawling face first into the muck. Cold, wet earth filled his mouth and nose, and he scrambled to his feet, spitting and gasping for air. The taste of mud was bitter, a reminder of the earth that had claimed so many lives. He glanced around, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment the world was silent. No whispers, no shadows, just the sound of his own ragged breathing. Relief washed over him, fragile and fleeting. He took a shaky step forward, then another. Maybe he had escaped. Maybe he had a cold hand wrapped around his ankle. Hugh screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the forest. He kicked and thrashed, but the grip was unbreakable. He looked down, his eyes wide with terror. Mud-covered roots had twisted around his leg, dragging him back toward the ground. They moved with a life of their own, writhing and tightening like serpents. The cold seeped into his skin, numbing him from the inside out. "Let me go," he cried, his voice cracking with desperation. He clawed at the ground, his fingers digging into the mud, but it was no use. The roots pulled harder, dragging him backward. The earth beneath him shifted, and he realized with dawning horror that the mud itself was alive, moving and churning like a living thing. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. Pale and translucent, their forms flickered like dying flames. Lan stood at the forefront, her eyes dark and hollow. Beside her were others' faces Hugh recognized, faces that had been buried by the landslide. They stared at him with a mixture of sorrow and fury, their presence a tangible weight that pressed down on his chest. "You cannot escape what you have done," Lan said, her voice cold and unyielding. She stepped closer, her bare feet leaving no trace on the ground. "You stole from us. You defiled the dead." "I didn't mean to," Hugh choked out, tears streaming down his face. "I was desperate. I didn't know your greed has sealed your fate." Another voice in tone, low and resonant. It belonged to an older man, his spectral form twisted and broken. "We are bound to this earth by your betrayal. You must pay the price." The roots tightened around Hugh's body, pulling him deeper into the mud. He struggled, panic surging through him, but the more he fought, the stronger their grip became. The spirits closed in, their expressions unyielding. The cold seeped into his bones, sapping his strength. He felt the earth pressing against him, crushing him. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll do anything. There is nothing you can do," Lan said, her gaze piercing through him. "The dead demand justice," with a final, wrenching pull. The roots dragged Hugh down. The mud rose around him, swallowing him inch by inch. He thrashed and screamed, his hands clawing at the air, but there was no escape. The cold, wet earth closed over his head, muffling his cries. Darkness enveloped him, heavy and suffocating. For a moment he thought he saw Lan's face, her expression softening, almost pitying. But then the mud pressed in, and all was silence. Days passed before the villagers found him. His body lay half buried in the mud, his face frozen in a mask of terror. The bundle of money was nowhere to be found. No one dared to touch the ground where he lay. They spoke in hushed tones of curses and spirits, of greed and retribution. The forest seemed to watch them, the wind whispering secrets they could not understand. Hugh's fate became a warning, a story told to children and whispered around fires. Those who stole from the dead would never find peace. The spirits of the wrong would see to that. And as the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of a mournful wail, the villagers knew that the dead still watched, waiting for justice to be done. Part 9. Lingering Spirits. The morning sky was an oppressive grey, heavy with the memory of the storm that had torn their world apart. Rain still lingered in the air, hanging like a veil over the shattered village, muffling every sound. The ground was soaked, mud clinging to the feet of those who gathered to honor the dead. They stood in silence, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion, their clothes damp and clinging to their bodies. This was a village well accustomed to hardship, but this tragedy had struck deep. Too many lives lost, too many souls ripped away by the unrelenting force of the mountain. In the center of the gathering, 3 freshly dug graves lay side by side. Simple wooden markers, hastily carved with trembling hands, bore the names of Sen, Lan, and Loi. The villagers worked quietly, their movements slow and deliberate. Each shovelful of earth that fell upon the graves was heavy with sorrow, a final act of love and farewell for those who had been claimed by the landslide's fury. An elderly man, his back bent with the weight of years and sorrow, stepped forward. He was the village elder, a man who had seen too much suffering in his time. His voice, though low and steady, carried over the hushed crowd. "We honor the lives of Sen, Lan, and Loi," he said, pausing to swallow the lump in his throat. "They were taken from us too soon, by forces beyond our control. We offer them peace in the earth, and we pray that they find rest." The villagers bowed their heads, a murmur of prayers rising into the air. Mothers clutched their children closer, as if to shield them from the specter of loss that hung over the gathering. Tears mingled with the rain, and for a moment it seemed as if the world itself wept for the lives cut short. But even as the earth was piled upon the graves, a sense of unease lingered. Whispers had already begun to spread through the village, whispers of shadows that moved when they should not, of cold winds that came from nowhere, and of a presence that watched from the mountainside. It was said that Lan's spirit had been seen, her sorrowful eyes gazing down upon the village he had once called home. Some claimed to hear her voice on the wind, soft and mournful, while others spoke of glimpses of a pale figure standing among the trees, her form flickering like a candle in the dark. In the days that followed, the stories only grew. Children who wandered too close to the landslide's edge spoke of feeling an unseen hand brush their hair, or a sudden chill that sent them running back to their parents. Hunters returning from the forest whispered of a girl with mud-streaked hair, watching them from a distance, her gaze piercing and unblinking. Those who had taken part in the burial avoided the sight whenever possible, their faces pale and drawn. The dead had not found peace, they said, not yet. For Hugh's death had not gone unnoticed. His body had been found half buried in mud, his face twisted in terror. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, fearful of invoking whatever curse had claimed him. The bundle of money he had stolen was gone, but the memory of his greed remained. The elder warned them to tread carefully, to respect the dead and the forces that lingered in the shadows, but fear had already taken root. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of crimson and grey, A young boy named Tam ventured too close to the edge of the landslide. He had heard the stories, of course everyone had, but curiosity got the better of him. He crept closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. Tam shivered, telling himself it was just the wind, just his imagination. But then he saw her. Lan stood at the edge of the broken earth, her form pale and translucent. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and kindness, were now dark pools of sorrow and anger. She looked at Tam, and for a moment he felt as if she could see every secret, every fear he had ever known. The boy stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. Lan raised a hand, not to harm, but, as if to warn. "Leave this place," her voice whispered, carried on the wind. "The dead are not to be disturbed." Tam scrambled away, his legs shaking. He told the others what he had seen, and the story spread like wildfire. The villagers spoke of Lan not as a spirit of vengeance, but as a guardian, a protector of what had been lost. She was bound to the mountain, they said, watching over the place where her family had perished, ensuring that no betrayal would go unpunished. Those who ventured too close felt her presence, a cold reminder of the price of greed. Over time, the village came to accept her presence. Offerings were left at the edge of the landslide, small tokens of respect, food, flowers, and prayers. No one dared to take from the earth or disturb the resting place of the dead. They spoke of Lan with reverence and fear, for they knew that her sorrow was not easily forgotten. One cold night, as the wind howled through the trees and the moon hung low in the sky, an old woman sat by her fire, telling stories to the children gathered around her. "1. She said, her voice low and steady, there was a girl who loved her family more than anything. When they were taken from her, she became their guardian, watching over their resting place. Those who show respect need not fear her, but those who seek to take what is not theirs, they will know her wrath." The children listened, wide-eyed, as the fire crackled and the shadows danced. Outside, the wind carried a whisper, soft, mournful sound that seemed to echo through the mountains. It was a reminder, a warning, and a promise that the spirits of the wronged were never truly gone. They lingered, watching, waiting, ensuring that no betrayal would ever go unpunished again. Lan's spirit remained, a silent sentinel on the mountainside. Her gaze was sorrowful, her presence cold, but she was more than a ghost. She was a protector, a reminder of the cost of greed and the unbreakable bond of love that even death could not sever. The villagers would remember, and they would honor her memory. For as long as Lan watched over them, they knew that the dead would have their justice and the living would tread carefully in the shadow of the mountain.